Start my stopwatch for 12 minutes. And where is Tati Yoko Mbela? Is he around? Who I was taught? There he is. There he is. Now, I had this as my speech, but because Margaret's told me to cut it to 12 minutes, and I had a fascinating conversation here, I've thrown it out, and I'm just going to tell you a few stories. Okay. And it's not your story, but I hope that you equate it. In West Africa, they have a thing called the stilted devil dancer. And this is a huge character on stilts that comes out of the jungle into the villages at the dead of night, and all the children gather around. It's like a sort of mythical monster. And they have a sort of fear festival in a way. And I went to this, and they had one of these in an obscure village, and they had campfires all around blazing, a starlit night, and this huge figure to the drums that were beating and the instruments that were going, walked out of the jungle into the center of the village. And all the children were screaming, and the adults were like this. And one of the people I was with was called Joshua Black, because Liberia is all the American ex-slaves and that. And Joshua Black said, "I'm here to worship the devil. I am a priest and I am a Christian, and I believe Jesus Christ is my savior." And I said, well, hold on a second, if you're worshiping the devil, how does all that work? And he said, because here in the African bush, we understand about power. And we know that you can defeat some power and you cannot defeat others. So power is neither good or bad, it's just something that is there, and you have to deal with it. I was doing a documentary at the time about Graham Greene's journey through Africa in the 1930s, and this was a few years back, seeing what had changed and what hadn't changed. And in Africa, however sophisticated you think it is in that part of Africa, there's a phrase that you have one foot in the bush and one foot in what we in the West call civilization. And they never really quite mesh. And what we've seen happening in the world since I've been involved with UPF for 20 years now, on and off, is this clash in wherever we go, whether it's Iraq, whether it's bits of Africa, whether now it's Brexit England, there's this sort of clash between who you are and who you are born as and where the world is going, the bush and civilization. And I want to move now to Sri Lanka because I got a phone call from a guy I met there 30 years ago. He's just turned 50. And I met him when he was 19. He was fluent in English, German, and French. He knew his Shakespeare. He knew his Hindu tracts and his Bible. He was the son of the Postmaster General of Sri Lanka. I met him with a Kalashnikov around his shoulder, belts of ammunition around there, up in Jaffna at the start of the Sri Lankan Civil War. He had everything going for him. I won't tell you his real name, but his nom de guerre at that stage was Rahim. And he was a member of the Tamil Tiger guerrilla group that some of you might be familiar with. This was in 1986, so it hadn't become what it was then. It was just sort of beginning, feeling its way. And the Tamil Tigers gave Rahim to myself because I was a journalist, he spoke English, and he showed me around. They showed me all the things that the Tamil Tigers were building that the Sri Lankan government hadn't built. Because the Sri Lankan government was predominated by Sinhala Buddhists, and the Tamils were Hindus that originated from across the water in millions of years ago in India. There was an ethnic difference between them. Under the British, the Tamils had actually been quite good at bookkeeping and civil service and all that sort of thing, so they ended up in the top jobs. It wasn't necessarily racial discrimination, it's just that that was their aptitude, in a way. So the Sinhalese had, in the previous years, gone about repressing the Tamils in the most horrendous way. They burnt the library down, they massacred women and children in villages and all that sort of thing. So Rahim and his people formed the Tamil Tigers to stop that repression. Now, Rahim could have gone either way. He could have gone to Oxford or Harvard and become a UN diplomat. But he chose, or was chosen at the age of 19, to become a guerrilla fighter. In the years that I knew him, the Tamil Tigers became the most vicious, violent, and murderous terrorist group anywhere in the world. They invented practically the child soldier. They invented the suicide vest. They invented the cult of the leader, in this case, Vallabhbhai Prabhakaran. They perpetuated a war that went on until 2009, 25 years. And somewhere around the, I don't know what you want to call it, I was there 86, maybe 90 something, the moral balance first equalized and then shifted. So the good guys to begin with were the Tamils fighting, and then they, because they couldn't win, and we see this here, we're seeing it with the Conservative Party in Britain actually, and I'll give you that parallel in a second. But because they couldn't win, they turned in on themselves, and the strongest or most extreme took power. And then because they couldn't win, they became more and more violent. They didn't think about how to build a road or a railway or a school. They thought about how do you build the best suicide bomb? How do you most efficiently blow up an airliner? How do you assassinate the Prime Minister-elect of India? And each time they did something like that, they thought they had scored a victory, but they actually came nowhere near to their final goal of what they wanted to achieve. Are you listening there in the back? Because we were just talking about that, weren't we? Of what they wanted to achieve. So Sri Lanka ended with the Tamils being defeated after huge suffering. Rahim, by that time, had been given asylum in Canada. And he's called me up from time to time, wondering if I could do this or that. But he's a lost soul. Yeah. And he sent me a photograph on his birthday, his 50th birthday, and he was sort of bloated and overweight and drinking beer and not doing much, trying to be involved in a cause that he could no longer have any input into. And because of what he'd done, he can't go back to Sri Lanka, and because he can't get a mortgage for his house because of this, that, and the other, and he's on a terrorist watch list. And so his whole life has sort of gone, essentially. And I think what I'm saying here is about, and this is, I'm going to get onto UPF in a second here because they're so good at this, is you've got to recognize what power is. And we see so many times, particularly in, say, the Israeli-Palestinian issue or the Sunni-Shia issue or something like that, somewhere where because somebody is doing something morally wrong, the people that are being mistreated think that the world can come and make everything right. And I think we now know, particularly in the present climate where everybody's become so insular and populist, or whatever you want to call it, that it doesn't work like that. And although in the case of Sri Lanka, the Tamils were repressed, and they probably still are now, they haven't won. The Palestinians haven't won. The Sunni-Shia thing's still ongoing, but it's dreadful. So these things are not simple. Now, I've been with UPF, not been with, because I don't belong to them, but I've worked with them for 20 years on and off, a lot of it on the Korean question. And when I first got in touch on Korea in the mid-90s, we were in a similar state now, where there was about to be a war with the United States. And where I was so impressed with a very good friend of mine, Antonio Betancourt, there was working all the corridors. So he would talk to a North Korean, not with a moral judgment, but with this guy has got a certain amount of power. How do we work around that to achieve what we want? And it's totally different from going up to somebody and saying, you're wrong, you deserve to be in prison. It's actually saying, no, what have these guys got, what can we give them and the rest of them? And because of what, was UPF around in those days or it had another name?
Another name. From 1999, yes.
It had another...
International Federation for World Peace.
That's right, yes. Whatever the organization was that I was with, that were instrumental, were the key instrumental people in drawing up the 1994 Framework Agreement, whereby there was peace on the Korean Peninsula, until George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld came along in 2003 and thought that they could invade both North Korea and Iraq simultaneously and turn everybody there into little democrats, because that's what they thought everybody wanted. And we know it's not like that, because all of us have one foot in the bush and one foot in civilization. And you cannot go into a country, whether it's Sri Lanka, North Korea, whatever. And the Koreans, and I say that, they know that. The North Koreans know how to use power and leverage. And the South Koreans obviously know that as well. And whenever I've dealt with UPF, what I like about it is it's so practical. It's about giving people control of their destiny and making them understand how they can achieve that destiny. It's not about, right, we've got to do this because it's the right thing to do, and we've got to destroy these people, or we've got to cry foul on something like that. It's about what's manageable and what's right. And one of the couple of groups I'll just wrap up that I've been involved in is the parliamentarians, which is great, because if you're a parliamentarian, it doesn't, I mean, from what I get, correct me if I'm wrong, we're here, right? I've got the right group. Is that I remember going to Saddam Hussein's parliament when he was in power, and the editors back in London said, well, you know, it's a rubber stamp parliament, isn't it? But believe me, when you've got a group of people together, there's no such thing as a rubber stamp. There's discussion, and there are views. And if you're a dictator or a democrat, you have to hold the room in order to push through what you want. And by putting the parliamentarians together, whether they come from North Korea or whether they come from Sudan or whether they come from Yemen or something, you're actually merging all these discussion tanks into one tank so that you know the process of government. Parliament is about the process of government. That, I think, is really great. And then we were, last week or a couple of weeks ago, doing a Young Achievers thing in Parliament, teaching young people that if you want to buy a house, but you can't, work out what law you want passed so that you can buy a house. Don't go around moaning that you can't get a job or you can't do that. Look at the mechanisms in which to do it. I'm just going to finish now, because when I went into North Korea with UPF or whoever they were at the time, we had a wonderful evening with the North Koreans. And I don't know whether how they were thinking then, but we were sitting in the hotel, and they were playing this martial music in the hotel, and everybody was going mad. And there were some Bulgarians, engineers, on the corner there, and they put a CD on that started playing Hey Jude by the Beatles. And we all rather liked that, tapping along to it. And I said, God, just imagine what would have happened if the Beatles hadn't broken up. What sort of music would they be playing now? And the two guides who we'd been laughing and drinking beer with and cracking jokes, they suddenly went like this, stone-faced. And one of them tapped me and says, Mr. Humphrey, can you come over here? So we went over there, and he said, Mr. Humphrey, you can't say that. I said, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't challenge him, because there's no point in challenging power. He said, I'm sorry, what's wrong? He says, the Beatles have not broken up. And I said, oh, haven't they? And he said, no, because the Beatles are coming to play for our great leader. And I had two double thinks there, because firstly the Beatles had grown up and the great leader was dead. But I left it at that, because I was their guest, they had the power, and we had a great evening. Thank you very much.